Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about inventory UI and specifically grid-based versus list-based user interfaces. This comes from a question from Kanza89 who asked, please do a video on grid versus list-based inventory. Isn't grid always better? You know I'm not going to say it's better. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of grid versus list. I almost didn't do this video, and I know Kanza, you asked this a long time ago, because I never feel like UX is my forte. In fact, I have a whole UX video where I talk about how it used to be nothing, and then it was user interface, UI, then it was user experience, UX. Now there are people who that's their title on the game is I'm the UX designer, or I'm the UX programmer, or I'm the UX artist. And this is so antithetical to my earlier experience where there were just a bunch of generalists. And one of the programmers went, well, I guess I'll do the interface for inventory. And an artist went, what do you need for icons? It was not as well thought out as it is today, which you may realize when you play one of my older games. So then I decided I would do this video, and what made me decide to do it was in the course of 6 years, I released 3 games. Fallout in 97, Arcanum in 2001, and Temple of Elemental Evil in 2003. And those 3 games used the major variations of these. Fallout was a pure list. It was, here's a bunch of icons, and for all of them, and when you hover over them, you get some description of what the item is. Arcanum did a grid with variable sizes for the items, which meant you not only had to pick things up by their weight, but you also had to play Tetris with your inventory to fit things onto the grid. I did try to provide a button to push everything over to collapse inventory, but a lot of people found that annoying. And then finally on Temple, we settled on grids, but with fixed shapes for all the items. So all the items were, whether it was a plate mail or a little potion, it was all 1 by 1, and it went on the grid. And then you can do weight, and I'll talk about that. So let's jump into pros and cons of list versus grid. And I'm going to say this from experience. So this is from the developer's side of things. And you can decide for yourself what you like to play. But I want to talk about the pros and cons of making all these things as list versus grid. Let's start with the list. Lists were really easy to implement for everyone, for the programmer, for the designer, for the artist. Because the list on the screen often directly corresponded to a list on the player character in memory. Here's a list of all the items they're carrying, and when you go bring up the inventory UI, you display that list, which is an array or maybe even a linked list of items in the order on the list. Very easy to do. It was also possible, we didn't do this for Fallout, but a lot of games do this, where the list itself isn't even icons. It's text. It's the name of the item, sometimes the name and its description right there in the list. That is even easier to do because it's all text-based and there are no needs for making icons because in any game, whether it's 2D or 3D, what an item looks like on the ground and what it looks like when you're wearing it or holding it, those are often different models. You need a third model for how it looks like in inventory. So yeah, in Arcanum, we had 3 different models for every item. It was the ground icon, the inventory icon, and then what it looked like when it went on your model. Lists are very easy to scroll because it's a list. It just goes up and down. And sometimes you don't even have to scroll the list. If it's a very short list of things you're carrying, you don't have to scroll it. Usually, though, probably you have to, but thankfully, it's easy to do. However, I would say the con of lists is because they almost always have to be scrolled, they also tend to grow quite long. Fallout's a perfect example of it only could show the first few items, and then you had to scroll and scroll and scroll to get the other things. The worst part about Fallout was we put new items at the end. I don't know why we did that. I think I even mentioned if I were to make Fallout now, new items would go at the top. But that's a con. So let me wait till I get to grids. I want to finish up talking why lists are so common and easy to do. The last one is something that didn't come up until we started making console and PC games, but it is very easy to make lists work with both a controller and with a keyboard and mouse. Because, like I said, it's a list of either icons or even just text, and it only goes up and down. So it's very easy to make controls that are intuitive and simple for both of those input methods. Now let's jump into grids, because grids are, I think, more common, especially nowadays. And let's talk about why that is. First of all, it's very easy for the player to visualize grids. I got an item, and it went into my inventory space, which is shown as a grid. Whether it's supposed to represent your backpack or bag or just this generic, I'm carrying a bunch of things, and here they are. It shows a grid. Very simple for the player to visualize it. Frequently, grids aren't scrollable, which makes them even easier to code and easier for the player to use. Here's an interesting thing. I'm not going to dive into it, and if you're more interested, I have not one but 2 different videos on encumbrance. Often it is accepted with grid-based inventories that you can't pick up any more when the grid is full. This is just a form of encumbrance, because it doesn't have anything to do with you may make a really strong character who could theoretically carry more, but it's a grid, and the grid is full, so you can't pick up anymore. Usually what games that do grid and encumbrance do is when the encumbrance of a character with a low strength, they would fill it up. Unless they're carrying lots of light items, they're going to not be able to fill the grid before their encumbrance kicks in. But in any case, grid limitations, for some reason, are way more accepted by players as you can't pick up any more because your grid is full, as opposed to you can't pick up any more because your encumbrance limit has been reached. Now, with grids, almost always that description has to go elsewhere. I don't think I've ever seen a text-based grid. Usually they're icons, and then the description is over in another panel. What this also means is if you do grid, you're always going to need those icons. And they're usually different, like I said, than how they appear on the ground or how they appear when you're wearing them. Some games use the ground one for the grid one and then have a separate one for you're wearing it. Some may say, well, what it looks like in the paper doll. There's a shrunken down version of what it looks like in the inventory. Fine, but you're going to need icons. Interestingly, some grids are scrollable, which raises 2 questions immediately. If you decide to make a scrollable grid, then why even do variable item size? Why even add that in? Like I said, I did variable item size for Arcanum, and then I never did it again. And if you're going to make a grid, I assume you're doing 1x1 icons for all your items, because otherwise the player can just scroll, and why make the density even spread out so much that you have to scroll? The other thing you need to think about if you're making a grid-based inventory is controller versus mouse usually requires 2 very different designs, because the way you move things around on the grid and select things from the grid is much more complicated than just going up and down in a list. So you really have to think about what you want to do there. I think the player-facing experience, though, is best on not just a grid, but a fixed item icon size on those grids. You will notice in my games, I eventually, after Temple, everything I did after that was fixed item sizes on a grid. Pillars of Eternity had that. Tyranny had that. The Outer Worlds had that. I think that's the best forward-facing player experience. I won't argue that it's the best, because it's harder to code, harder to design, especially for input use, and you need a lot more art for it. So from the developer point of view, it's a much more intricate process all around than just doing a list. Some players too do like lists because, like I said, if the list has the name of the item that when you're scrolling it, or even the name and a small description, it can be a lot easier to find items on a list. Because if you know the name and you can sort by name, or you just can scroll down really quickly and identify it by name, some people can do that faster than by icon, especially depending on how your icons are made. I've played games that do color-based icons, and the only difference between two robes were their color. That's really, really hard for me. So in games like that, I'm like, what? I just wish I could go text. But in general, I think if I had to answer Kanza89's question, I don't think Grid is better, but I do think for most game players, they find it the easiest interface to visualize and to use, despite the fact that game development is going to be a little harder. So I think that is why it is probably the most popular and commonly used inventory interface that you see in games today. Anyway, those are my thoughts on list versus grid UIs, and I hope you like that answer, Kanza89.